Now, if we look at the role of nuclear weapons in this, I would argue that nuclear weapons are not the cause of the Cold War. We would have had a Cold War there would have been rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States over the post-war settlement. But nuclear weapons gave a particular character to the Cold War. The perhaps not so important in the late 1940s and early 1950s before the development of the hydrogen bomb. But when the hydrogen bomb was tested by both the United States and the Soviet Union in the mid-1950s, it became clear that a nuclear war, or a war between the US and the Soviet Union that employed nuclear weapons, would be absolutely devastating. This was understood, I think, at the political level in all the three nuclear powers at the time, namely the US, the Soviet Union, and Britain. And therefore, you had a sense that something really had changed. The communist trope was that nuclear war would mean the end of civilization. It would certainly cause immense damage, cause the destruction of many lives. It would be much more destructive than World War II. And therefore, I think there was an understanding on both sides of the conflict that really a nuclear war was a very last thing that you wanted to get into, that it was at some level unacceptable. And I would even argue that Eisenhower understood that the Soviet leaders shared that view, and the Soviet leaders understood that Eisenhower shared that view as well. So there was something like what game theorists call common knowledge about the unacceptability of nuclear war. And in a way, it's because nuclear war was unacceptable, and Eisenhower's calculation that the Soviet leaders didn't want war, that you could have a policy of deterrence. After all, if you think they're not deterrable, then you would go for a preventive war, which people in the US in the early 50s were advocating, some people. Eisenhower rejected that and said, no, we can compete with the Soviet Union over the long haul. We can compete with a nuclear Soviet Union, and it doesn't mean that we have to get into war. And on the Soviet side, at about the same time, Khrushchev rejects Lenin's thesis that war was inevitable as long as imperialism existed, and put emphasis on peaceful coexistence with the West. War was no longer fatalistically inevitable. So in the mid-1950s, and I think it's a very important shift in the conflict, is that there's a sense that this is rivalry over the long term. We don't want to get into a nuclear war. None of us wants to get into a nuclear war. Of course, we prepare for it and we plan it, but the primary goal is deterrence, or to use the term on the American side, or a more general term on the Soviet side, namely prevention of a nuclear war. Now, you would think perhaps that would lay the basis for peaceful relations between the US and the Soviet Union. But of course, what happened was something different. And I want to quote to you a passage from, I hope I have it here, yes, John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State. In an interview in early 1956, he said, "You have to take chances for peace, just as you must take chances in war. Some say we were brought to the verge of war. Of course we were brought to the verge of war." And he's referring here to the Korean War and crises in East Asia and in Southeast Asia. "The ability to get to the verge without getting into war is the necessary art. If you cannot master it, you inevitably get into war. If you try to run away from it, if you are scared to go to the brink, you are lost. We have had to look it square in the face on the question of enlarging the Korean War, on the question of getting into the Indochina War, on the question of Formosa, it's Taiwan. We walked to the brink and we looked it in the face. We took strong action." And Dulles was roundly criticized by Adlai Stevenson, who was to be the Democratic candidate in the presidential election of 1956, for boasting of his brinkmanship. And that's where the term comes from, brinkmanship, which has entered into the language. And of course, Dulles was roundly criticized in the Soviet press for this statement. It was raising international tension. But we know from the memoirs of Khrushchev's son that Khrushchev had great admiration for Dulles. And why? And it's very interesting. He says, well, Dulles knew there was a brink, and he knew where it was. And Khrushchev's view was, and I quote, I think people with the strongest nerves will be the winners. That is the most important consideration in the power struggle of our time. The people with weak nerves will go to the wall. So the conclusion that Khrushchev drew, and indeed in a way that Dulles had drawn, although, as is often the case, the Soviet Union kind of pursued this goal with a greater intensity, the conclusion was, of course, we don't want to get into war. That's off the table. But let's see who has the stronger nerves in a crisis. And I think particularly in a kind of double crisis over Berlin from 1958 to 1962, Khrushchev really tried to implement that idea, to put pressure on the West, to conjure up the threat of nuclear war in order to get the Western powers to give up their rights in Berlin. Because he wanted to, as it were, remove the Western allies from their sectors in Berlin, and I think essentially have Berlin as a whole incorporated into the East German state. And he said at one point during the crisis to the Chinese foreign minister, when the foreign minister visited Moscow, this is in the summer of 1961, the most intense period of the crisis, he said, of course, we know that if we fire nuclear weapons at them, they're going to fire them back at us. And we think they're intelligent enough not to start a war. But this is all about, and said, war is the last thing we want, but this is a war of nerves. We're going to test who has the stronger nerves. And actually, in that crisis, the West proved to be quite strong, and Khrushchev had to back down from his main goal over Berlin, even though he got something by building the wall, which divided Berlin and stopped the outflow of people from East Germany to the West. But I think the statement that Khrushchev made about, well, Dulles, namely, he knew there was a brink and he knew where it was. What if you make a mistake about where the brink is? And I think the Cuban Missile Crisis illustrates that danger, that Khrushchev decided that he wanted to put the Soviet missiles and a Soviet group of forces into Cuba, and he did it in secret. At least it's intended to be in secret. It was a badly planned operation from the Soviet point of view. When the missiles were discovered, the American reaction was, this is absolutely unacceptable. You have to get these missiles out of Cuba. And we know from documents, from the notes of Politburo or meetings of the Soviet leadership, that Khrushchev, when he found out that the US knew that Soviet Union was putting missiles in Cuba, missiles that could strike large areas of the United States, his immediate reaction was to say, this isn't what I intended. Our aim was to defend Cuba. If they attack us, we have to respond, and then we're into a big war. And I think the following week from that meeting, which is just before Kennedy's speech, they have noticed that Kennedy is going to give a speech, the speech where he announces a quarantine on Cuba, and demands that the Soviet Union withdraw the missiles. So the Soviet leaders are sitting around before the speech. They guess it's going to be about Cuba, and that's Khrushchev's reaction. The following week, we see Khrushchev maneuvering to try to see if he can keep the missiles there, but eventually withdrawing them. And there you could say that was dangerous. I mean, it's dangerous for a number of reasons, but one of the dangers was a miscalculation on Khrushchev's part about what the American reaction would be. In some sense, he discovered in a way that the brink was not quite where he thought it was. On the other hand, he understood there was a brink during the crisis and withdrew the missiles. And that is probably the point, I think, in the Cold War, where by general consensus we came closest to a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we can think of the possible paths to war. One is miscalculation. A second is unauthorized actions by lower, not by the leaders, but by people in the military doing things or finding themselves in situations where they weren't sure what their orders were. There's a Soviet submarine that had a nuclear-tipped torpedo where the captain of the submarine apparently decided, yes, we should fire the torpedo, but was persuaded by other officers not to do so. We have accidents like an American U-2 plane straying well into Soviet airspace during the crisis. So I think we have to understand that even though we focus on the leaders, and I think rightly so, we have to take a more Tolstoyan attitude. You remember in War and Peace, Tolstoy says, you know, the sergeant in an army is as important as the Tsar or as Napoleon. I wouldn't go quite that far because I think what Khrushchev and Kennedy decided was extremely important. But nevertheless, we have to understand that the whole history is made up not just of the plans and ideas of leaders, but by the actions of many individuals, many of whom, or some of whom, could have taken actions that would trigger a further escalation of the crisis. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis had a profound effect. Brinkmanship didn't seem quite so attractive after Cuba. And we don't have, and I think that's true it's a general proposition, it's true in the US and in the Soviet Union. When Khrushchev was removed from power in October 1964 by his colleagues, one of the charges against him was that he had taken the world to the brink of nuclear war 3 times, over Berlin, over Cuba, and in the Suez Crisis of 1956. And they said, of course, sometimes you have to threaten the imperialists to sober them up, but that shouldn't be the permanent basis for your foreign policy.